What do the left and right get wrong about family policy? This event is co-sponsored by the Institute for Family Studies and PLOW, a magazine of stories, ideas, and culture to inspire faith and action. In my judgment, PLOW is one of the boldest, deepest, and most inspiring publications on what it means to be a human person today. It covers some really big things about life, and I strongly recommend that you subscribe. The topic for tonight is family policy, which narrowly understood is legislation either on a state or federal level designed to help give families the resources they need to form and thrive. There is a renewed interest in family policy in Washington, D.C., among the right and the left, but it takes a concrete form in President Biden's American Families Plan, which entails, among other things, several tax credits for families and a significant expansion of center-based daycare at the price tag of $225 billion. The backdrop for all that is the state of our families. They are struggling to pay the bills, and that affects everything, from marriage rates to fertility, which is at an all-time low in the US, to the very viability of the institution. And those are some of the big themes that we are going to address tonight. So now to our esteemed panel. So they are here because they're not easy to pin down and define, in my judgment of them, which I hope they will agree with me on that, when it comes to family policy and public life more generally, as being purely liberal or conservative. Their approaches to these questions are complex. And in a time of political realignment and upheaval, such as our own, I think it's particularly valuable to be open to what such figures have to say. So who will be hearing from tonight? We will be hearing from Christine Emba. She is an opinion editor and columnist at the Washington Post. Her work focuses on ideas and society, and she has a new book coming out in February of 2022 titled Rethinking Sex, a Provocation. It's a great title. Leah Libresco Sargeant is a contributing editor at the aforementioned PLOW. She is the author of 2 books, Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option, and she runs the Substack community Other Feminisms. And finally, we are joined by Joe Waters. He is co-founder and CEO of Capita, which works at the intersections of research, policy, social innovation, design, and the arts. So a broad swath of things to explore how the great cultural and social transformations of our day affect children and their families. Capita was founded in 2018, and it is already an important voice in many matters related to the family, but in particular, the child care discussion. My name is Michael Toscano. I am the executive director of IFS. I will be our host. To be forthright with you, I am a conservative. Christine and Joe, in their own ways, speak from the left of center. Leah, in her public affiliation with the American Solidarity Party, is speaking from somewhere that straddles the line between left and right, part liberal, part conservative. But I know from experience that each of our panelists is open to the ways in which the left and the right can sometimes fall short. This is obviously a fraught time politically, but despite that, there's much work that needs to be done for our families. And that's why we're gathered here for this discussion. So let's get started. I should remind you that we will be taking your questions in the YouTube comment box. And after we go through about maybe half an hour between us, we'll turn it over to you guys. So let's start with Christine, because she wrote something recently that I thought was really good and got at this complexity. Christine, on May 7th of this year, you published an op-ed in the Post with this eye-catching title. When it comes to Biden's childcare provisions, the GOP actually has a point. In it, you argue that some Republican senators, almost by accident, have developed a superior plan to the Biden administration on childcare. Would you tell us why you think that?
Sure. So, yes, I published this right after Joe Biden announced the American Families Plan in his first major speech in his first 100 days. And as he stated and as you outlined, the plan is 1.8 trillion, and it contains a number of different provisions for children and families. Specifically, it would offer free preschool to 3 and 4-year-olds through a government set up and subsidized network of child care providers. It would extend the existing child tax credit, which has been grown during the pandemic, and make that permanent and fully refundable. And it would also add to that tax credit another tax credit, or rather extend another tax credit, the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, which could cover as much as half of family spending on child care outside the home. And that's the thing about this plan. It does offer an enormous, comparatively, sum of money to families for children, but it actually mainly focuses on supporting and subsidizing childcare outside of the home. Administration officials have stated openly that part of their reasoning behind this plan was, having observed the number of women who left the workforce during the pandemic, one of their priorities is getting them back into the workforce, getting them back to their jobs. And so this plan seemingly prefers to subsidize childcare in order to move families, heads of families, back into the workforce rather than staying home with their children. The thing is, that may be a priority for certain members of the administration and certain thinkers in the government, but it actually isn't the preference of most American families, especially middle-class families and lower-wage families. In surveys, most say that they would actually prefer to have one parent staying at home with children and one parent in the workforce. And this plan does not actually encourage that. But in contrast, surprising to me, Republicans have offered a plan, or several plans, in fact, that skip the child care credits and give all of the money directly to parents who can then choose how to spend it. So they may, in fact, want to pay for daycare and go back to work, but they could also use that money to pay to homeschool their children, to pay for one parent to be able to stay at home with their kids. And I think that this is a better plan. I think it provides families with more optionality. It allows families to make the choices that suit them best. And it doesn't also, rope the government into a long-term spending plan based on an extended form of childcare that may not have been tested and may not be best suited for the United States. And at the very least, will take a while to sort out. And I said I found this surprising because, well, frankly, the GOP and conservatives are not known for giving money to people or offering to give money directly to families and let them do what they will. In this case, I thought that actually Biden should take a leaf from their book. This is the first time they're offering something this generous. He should run with it.
Yeah, Christine, in the piece, you also have critical words for the GOP on other points. And would you tell us what you think that the GOP gets wrong on this issue, in particular for childcare?
Well, for childcare, I think it's actually part and parcel with the GOP's position towards families and individuals and individual thinking. For decades now, the GOP and conservatives have demonized the idea of a safety net, saying that things like an increased minimum wage or family leave time, or during the pandemic, extended unemployment insurance would make individuals dependent, would make them soft. People would stop working. They wouldn't care about being part of society. And that's not true. In fact, most people want to work. Most people want to be productive members of society. They want to make money to be able to take care of their children in many cases. And the reason, in fact, why many people leave the workforce, especially mothers, is because they simply don't make enough and don't have the support needed to be able to balance a work life with their family life. I think that the GOP would do well to pay more attention to what families actually need. When you think about promoting family life, promoting, say, childbirth, we talked about our falling fertility rates. The reasons why many millennials are not having children is not because they're lazy or because they want to work more. It's because they don't have the financial support. They cannot depend on the government. They cannot depend on a safety net. They worry about their wages staying flat or sinking. And this is something that GOP policies would encourage. This is the opposite of supportive for families.
Great. Joe, I know you draw a different conclusion on the childcare issue than Christine, but I want to get your broader perspective before we bore down to that issue specifically. So I'm going to ask you the same general question as Christine, but put it this way. If you were speaking to the leadership of the GOP, how would you explain to them the role that you believe the federal government should play in helping American families?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to you and to Plow for having us. Firstly, I think I would clarify what family policy is and what it isn't. Family policy does not simply mean anti-poverty policy, though of course that's important. But I take family policy to mean any effort on the part of the government and policymakers to promote the health and well-being as it truly is, the seedbed of the city, to use St. Augustine's phrase. So I would just clarify that family policy pertains to the family as the first and vital cell of society. It demands nurture from the intermediary institutions of society, church, mosque, synagogue come to mind first, and protection from the government. So the family, all families, rich and poor, firstly need and deserve protection from that which would harm it. And here I think is where I begin perhaps to diverge from some of my friends on the right in terms of where I put the emphasis. And it's the emphasis on threats. Workism is a threat to the family. Big tech is a threat to the family. The endless stream of advertising with which our kids' heads are filled are threats. Student debt is a threat. The absence of a family wage is a threat. Extreme weather and extreme heat and displacement as a result of ecological degradation is going to be more of a threat in the future, and so forth. So we must first identify and then attempt, in as much as the government is capable, to eliminate threats to family security. And then secondly, we should work to improve the condition of families qua families, not just as collections of individuals, and improve the situation for families in poverty or without a working adult or who suffer from chronic or terminal illness or whatever the case may be. And when it comes to improvement, I think we have a responsibility to exercise a preferential option for poor families. And the best way to improve things for poor families is to ensure jobs for those who can work without taking parents who want to stay in the home out of the home and away from kids, and some sort of social security for those with adults who cannot work, those families with adults who cannot work. And so again, I think we need to both focus on protection and then on improvement.
Now, if you were, if I give you an opposite challenge, if I were to say to you, now talk to your friends on the left and explain to them where you part ways with them, I'd be interested to hear where that might be.
Well, first, I would speak to my progressive friends, and I would distinguish here between my progressive friends and my liberal friends, and say that we must recognize that there are limits to what government can do. And this is an important lesson that I've learned from reading back issues of The Public Interest. First, society is complex, and progressive policy often flattens that complexity. That complexity demands limits, it demands prudence, and here, of course, subsidiarity figures in as well. All things out of favor across the political spectrum, I would endeavor. We can't do, especially at the federal and the state level, everything that might be salutary for families. And this is, again, where subsidiarity must figure in strongly, right? There are these other intermediary institutions in society that need to really step up and support families. Liberals, again, as distinguished from progressives, should recognize the limits of symbolism and remember that one thing the government does really well is distribute money. Another program with weak evidence employing middle-class social workers to minister to the poor is not a substitute for money or for jobs when it comes to family security.
All right, so now let's take it to the childcare issue. Where do you part with Christine on that issue in particular?
Well, frankly, Michael, I'm not sure that I do, and I hate to ruin the discussion, but I'm not sure that I am an enthusiastic supporter of the Biden childcare plan. There's some good things about it. Paid leave is in there, right? I think that's important, but when it comes to the childcare in particular, I want to associate myself, I think, primarily with the criticisms that Matt Brunig has offered of the childcare portion of this. Here, however, is what we do know. Many families need childcare to work, and many childcare businesses are failing without government assistance because families cannot pay the full cost of childcare. First, we need to do something that privileges, we need to do something for families who cannot pay for childcare without privileging those who choose to stay at home with their children, right? According to Child Trends, 97% of childcare settings, 97% of childcare settings are in a home, not in centers. Those centers serve about 1/3 of all the kids in childcare. And of home-based providers, 72.5% are unpaid and caring for a relative or another child that they know, right? So we need to get money to families in a way that allows them to choose the types of care they want for their families. However, in the 3% of settings that are centers, and the 27.5% that are home-based providers who are paid for their services, we need to save them just like we saved the airlines. And frankly, we continuously shore up the airlines through programs like the Essential Air Service program. There does not have to be, to my mind at least, a contradiction between getting families money in a care or child allowance and helping childcare businesses that persistently struggle. Most conservatives lost no sleep, I would assume, I could be wrong about this, when people bought airline tickets with their stimulus checks after we had bailed out the airlines. There is no inherent contradiction from where I sit between helping corporations and industries and providing money to parents and carers. However, I do think I am with Brunig. We need to stop fighting the cultural mommy wars over whether stay-at-home parents are good or bad, and craft a childcare system that supports parent care and center-based care by providing some sort of subsidy for both center-based care, if that's what people choose, paid in-home care, if that's what people choose, or for parents who wish to stay home with their children.
And I think actually, just to jump in really quickly, Joe makes a really good point here about subsidiarity and allowing decision-making to devolve to families, right? One of the things that I think we both find to kind of criticize in this plan is that it does seek to push families in a certain direction, either to put their kids in care, to go back to work, or to simply discourage them from keeping their kids at home, even if they want to. The thing is, as Joe mentioned, families are diverse, and also most parents care very much for their children, want what's best for them, and know them well. They know what will work for their families. Some children might do better staying at home. Some children would actually really benefit from going to a center. The government should support parents in making the decisions that are best for their families, yes, but it should also let the families make those decisions. And I think that's the plan that all three of us maybe would be interested in.
Yeah.
Well, Christina, I was going to ask you to respond, so thank you for that. Now let's bring in Leah. No, perfect. So Leah, I know you to be a keen observer of politics in this country, both left and right. So though you are a member of the American Solidarity Party, I feel like you can speak outside of your party's vision. So there's a lot of disagreement on the right today. So I'm going to ask you to actually do just a little bit of spade work for us. There's a struggle within the Republican Party about the role of the federal government in families' lives. So would you just first just do a little preliminary work and just kind of maybe explain the different camps that are forming, and then from your vantage point at the ASP, why do you stand where you do in relation to that?
I think it's really interesting because, from what I'm hearing from my fellow panelists, the thing that brings us all together here are two extremely non-divisive people who unite the left and the right, and it's Mitt Romney and Matt Bruenig, two people whose whole careers are marked by unity and joy. But they're both pushing in the same direction, which I think is interesting. And I think it's less because of their leftness or rightness and more because they're just serious about what families are and what they need. And they're putting that first. And then their ideology is shaping a little bit of their response, but they so have the actual needs of the family at the heart of their plans that that's how they kind of seem to converge. Now, on the side of the Republicans, there are still actually substantial fissures. I wish Biden had just taken Mitt Romney's proposal and run with it. Go with the bipartisan goal here. Mitt Romney is focusing on distributing money to parents forever. It's not a 1-year subsidy for parents like Biden's plan. It's a forever plan. It happens automatically. You don't have to sign up for it. There's no, I don't pay taxes, so how do I fill out this web form to qualify? It's just that the Social Security Administration knows you have a baby because you got a birth certificate, and money starts immediately going to you by direct deposit or check from when the baby is born. It's simple, it's direct, it's well needed. And Romney pays for it by kind of clearing away the cruft of policies that might have been a good idea at the time, but have been neglected and allowed to collapse financially. Programs like TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, which really doesn't live up to the promise of the proposal, partly because it's been kneecapped by its block grant structure and work requirements. But while it used to serve 68 out of 100 families in poverty in 1996, which already not great for a program that's meant to serve 100% of families in poverty, as recently as 2012, it only served a quarter of families in poverty. So Romney's making this very naked appeal. Families need money. We have to think about what's the easiest and simplest way to get it to them. Now, Republicans have objected on the grounds that it's not doing enough to make sure the families deserve it. Mike Lee and Marco Rubio, both Republican senators, objected, saying there's no work requirement. These people don't deserve it. They don't qualify. It could go to anyone. And I think that's exactly where Romney's right. It's going to anyone. If you have a child, that's your qualification. But there's a hesitancy or a suspicion in the GOP that really doesn't suit an ostensibly pro-life party. The claim of the Republicans, is that children bring with them certain necessary duties. You can't unchoose a child once they exist. You can't walk away from them. And we ask what government is supposed to do. It protects our freedom to live out the duties we have. And if each of us have a duty to a child from the moment of conception, then part of government's role is saying, how do we free people to best live out that duty, chosen or unchosen? There's no question of, are you qualified to be a parent? Do you deserve to be a parent? You are a parent already. How do we help smooth that way? So I think that's the primary tension I see that, and I'm honestly very disappointed to see this question of desert for parents, of qualification to deserve support, rather than really leaning into the rhetoric of children bring with them a certain duty. Government therefore has a duty to respond and help you live out that relationship.
So Leah, do the same thing in the other direction. Talk to the leadership in the Democratic Party, and tell us where they're mistaken.
And I hope they can take me seriously on this, because I used to be wrong in the same way. I used to have big Cass Sunstein feelings about using policy to help people make their lives better by putting more constraints on the policy to push them towards the decision that was best for them, whether or not they realized it at the time. And I think both the GOP and the Dems do this occasionally. You see this a lot in regulations that I've come to believe are bad around food stamps. We want to both give people money for food and we want to help them eat better. So let's restrict what they can buy. That doesn't work out in practice. The restrictions wind up complicated to navigate, kind of contradictory, since our nutrition recommendations change every 2 weeks almost, and they make it harder for families just to put food on the table. You can want people to eat healthier, but the solution to do that isn't to kind of restrict their wallet with the money you're ostensibly giving to help. In the childcare policy put forward by the Democrats, I see the same kind of error. There's the belief that what's best for everyone is centralized childcare run by professionals. And there's, first of all, no evidence that's actually best for everyone. And there's certainly no evidence that that's what people want. Christine and Joe have both talked a bit about how the polling makes it pretty clear that many parents, unsurprisingly, want the option to be home with their child. They want at least one parent to be able to do that. They want a family member to be able to do that. They want to work part-time if that's an option. And I think part of where the Democrats go wrong is that it's much more common among richer people or better educated people to want to stay at work and use professional childcare. And that's a lot more like the people often in Congress or lobbying Congress. And that distorts what policies we seriously consider. But if they want to think about the alternative, they only need to ask Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's spoken at length about how her Aunt Bee is the person who helped her have a career and have the life she has now fighting for other families. It wasn't because she had a centralized childcare option, it's because she had a family member who loved her and loved her kids, and they had the flexibility to, share the burden of parenting, the duty of parenting together. That's what a lot of parents say is their ideal, not standing totally alone as a stay-at-home mom or dad and not relying totally on professionals. It's having kind of a hybrid of, I want to really do things as a parent. I want to be able to get support from friends and family. Amy Coney Barrett had the same kind of arrangement where a close family friend provided a lot of childcare to their family. We know that it works, but we have to be serious about making that a real solution for parents and giving them the flexibility in their funding to kind of try out a variety of solutions over their life and see what works for their individual family.
Joe and Christina, if you'd like to reply to Leah, I'd love to hear how you'd respond to what she just said.
Well, I would pull from both Leah and Joe to pull out the word workism, which you've both mentioned. And actually just hearing you both talk, it's clear that, workism, the idea that work is everything and that Americans as individuals should be focused on work is actually coming from both sides of the room. On the left, it tends to look like work is super fulfilling. Work is the one thing that gives us our personalities and makes us human. Everybody should be made as able as possible to go to work because work is great and fun and we love that and we miss it. The opposite is happening on the right. It's workism, but for lower income Americans in many cases. Workism that says you need to prove that you are a worthwhile citizen by working. You need to be out there in the economy, otherwise we're not going to help you in any way. You have to show your work to be able to care for your children. In fact, work may be more important than those children. And that's not healthy either. I think what all three of us maybe are looking for is a way to push back on that from both sides. And actually, I do think that we're seeing some groundswell in this realization from both politicians and the everyday American. After this pandemic, especially, many Americans have realized that their jobs, in fact, are not worth more than their lives, for instance. And actually, they enjoy spending time with their families. They enjoy being able to focus on other parts of their lives. A good child tax credit or a child care proposal or some sort of support to families, whatever that looks like. Family policy, as Joe describes it, would actually focus on allowing people to spend time with their families, actually focus on moving away from workism and instead supporting a family-centered, society-centered ideal. What that would look like combining both sides, I think we're not sure yet, but there is a direction that seems clear and also a clear thing, workism, that we're trying to move away from.
It's a really interesting point, Christine. Leah, were you gonna reply?
I think this really points to the hollowness of some of the ways we measure the health of our society. You can think about using GDP as the measure of what's happening or what people are doing, where, my husband and I could help boost GDP a little by getting married every year and then divorced the subsequent year. And our continual spending on weddings and lawyers is productive in the sense of measured by GDP, money is moving around, goods and services are being purchased, but nothing of worth is being done. And similarly, if Christine and I, both have kids, suddenly we enter the economy and our work is worthwhile if instead of taking care of each of us our own kid, Christine sends her child to me and I send my daughter to her, and we pay each other. We have to make sure we do the taxes right, and we're not doing it off the books. But the second we're exchanging money and the second we're not caring for our own families out of love, it becomes real work. The same diapers being changed, the same messes being cleaned up. As long as it's not for your family, it counts. And if it is for your family, it doesn't. And I think that kind of sleight of hand maneuver to transform, non-work into work shows how empty this is. Society can't run without a lot of work that isn't people's jobs and that isn't compensated, perhaps should be better compensated both in respect and in money. But we've had a hollowing out of volunteer organizations, of kind of just convivial societies, of block parties. And when we lose that, we lose a lot of the kind of basic fabric that helps people absorb shocks, that help people get through a hard year like this past one. We've seen an expansion. In my own town, there's a new mutual aid group that started during the pandemic and has persistently kept going, cataloging neighbors' needs and trying to figure out how to meet them. But to engage in that kind of work, which isn't someone's job and isn't paid, people need leisure time. So it's not just families who need leisure and time and an identity outside of work, it's everyone, because we don't just care for our neighbor at the office. And I think for many people, that can be the least fulfilling part of their week, or the part where they're least confident that the time they're putting in really has a positive effect on the world.
Yeah, and I just want to build off of your reference to the Elizabeth Warren example, Leah, because I think it's so interesting that it was Aunt B. It wasn't professional childcare worker B, right, who provided that help. And I often wonder if the Democrats' proposal isn't an effort, I think it is an effort to ameliorate the loss of community, the loss of extended families and networks that would have typically provided that care, maybe in prior generations, but of course that is romanticized, right? And that what the Democrats should be doing, rather than focus just on ameliorative policies like the child care policy, which is focused on getting women back into work because, we might live hundreds of miles from the nearest relative or whatever the case may be, right? And focus on policies that would rebuild those intermediary institutions, those social networks, those social connections that are so vital, right, to not only our health, well-being, and flourishing as individuals and communities and families, but are actually really practically quite useful when it comes to children.
Yeah, and I do think that this is, where your distinction between liberals and progressives becomes an interesting one, Joe, because I think a lot of these policies that you suggest that would allow families to rebuild themselves, that would support these wider spread groups and these ties of, if not necessarily kinship, deep friendship, or simply mutual aid, are being pursued by progressives. There are, pushes against single family homes or single family zoning, such that you could build a smaller dwelling for a grandparent or an aunt on your own parcel of land. Those are things that progressives are pushing for, ways to sort of rebuild these community networks. But as Leah says, they sometimes don't necessarily appear productive in the economic sense. They don't necessarily contribute to the wealth being or the wealth gain, rather, of, frankly, people who are already wealthy, and thus they don't get the same support. I think to have a real family supporting policy, you'd have to do more than just focus on, we're fixing childcare right now. We are fixing this part of the tax code. We would really need to have kind of a wholesale, almost revolution in how we think about society and what things we support, whether that's trying to lower housing costs so that people can live closer to their families and those they love, closer to their workplaces or further away, commute in a subsidized manner as necessary. A lot of things would have to change. And while, we're more open to change in this moment, it'll be interesting to see what does last.
Christine, I think some of the biggest potential is about how work is constructed. Everyone's had the experience of finding out what rules didn't actually matter about work during the pandemic. The extent to which you can work from home on a flexible schedule in many jobs and things won't collapse. And I'm hoping that really leaves a lot more room to agitate for that kind of flexibility that, again, parents in particular need, but everyone can make use of, because everyone has people they care for, institutions they care for, personal projects that benefit from some flexible time that your employer doesn't own. It's a real opportunity to push back against the increasing encroachment of, online work, email, Slack, et cetera, that kind of creeps into your nights and weekends, setting firm boundaries and treating work as a part of a life and not the heart of a life.
So it's great when your pre-written questions are tracking well with where you guys are going, but you could also tell from this next question, before we turn it over to the audience, that I was expecting more division. But I'm going to read it to you as I wrote it. We live in an extraordinary time. 2020 was one of the great social disasters in American history, with unprecedented challenges for families flowing from it. So do you foresee any areas of convergence, any common ground between left and right that could be good for families? I think we were going here, so let's just bring it home there, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. And I'd like to hear from all three of you on that, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll pick up on what Christine was saying, and I think that there is an opportunity around mutualism, right, writ large, to support our families and our communities. And I think that there are progressives who are interested in that, whether that takes the form of mutual aid societies or cooperatives or federal policy. And I think that there are also certainly conservatives who are interested in that. And wherever it is that I sit, I'm very interested in that.
I'm kind of hoping that we can trick both sides into feeling just arrogant enough to think that giving people money will allow everyone to express their true preferences, which of course, match that of the politicians. And so we can get the money out the door before anyone's the wiser, and parents can really make the choices that are best for them. And we can all learn a little about what that is, rather than trying to narrow their options or qualify them too aggressively. And I do think, there's been a tendency, again, especially on the Democratic side, to talk as though it's so obvious that child care centers are what everyone wants. So I'm hoping, let's call that bluff. Give the money unrestricted, believe that that's what people will buy, and we'll find out when the checks go out.
That is a really interesting question, Michael. I think, like Leah, I am hopeful about the idea of giving people money. I think that in the pandemic, we have seen how quickly that can have an impact, and how that positive impact can, in fact, rebound in all sectors of society, both the economy, which we value, in my opinion, rather over highly, to individual everyday lives. That said, I do think that the pandemic has exposed for many people on the right and on the left what actually matters to them, where their hearts lie, what they are afraid of losing, and what things they would like to gain. So we've seen people valuing, again, time with their families more. We've seen the value of women's work, simply the care of children, the taking care of the home, how much that actually takes, and how, in fact, the work schedule that we have acclimated to, that we say is normal, is in fact antithetical to a normal life. We've seen now there is higher unemployment insurance, that actually people would prefer to have jobs that frankly pay them a living wage and that respect them as persons with human dignity. And in this moment, because there is that insurance, they're willing to wait to find those jobs. Maybe that will push employers to provide those jobs, and push perhaps the government to begin to regulate so that more of those jobs exist. I don't know what is going to last. I think we're already seeing our society begin to slide back to what it looked like before, but I'm hoping that some of these realizations stick.
Great. So we have a few questions here. Christine, there is a point of clarification for you on Twitter. Christine said most people, quote unquote, most people want to work / be productive members of society, but also that, quote, most middle income / low income families want to have one parent at home. Which is it? So again, most people want to work and be productive members of society, but also that most middle income, low income families want to have one parent at home. Which is it?
So both, actually. And I think this highlights something that all three of us in different ways, we're trying to get at. When I say that most people want to work and want to be productive members of society, I don't actually necessarily equate working and being a productive member of society with working for a wage from an employer outside the home. I think, in fact, that one parent staying home with a child, helping to raise an infant, a small human, to an adult is extremely productive and contributes a huge amount to society. And as anyone who is a parent can tell you, I think you could tell us this, Michael, you were chatting about this before the panel started, that's also hard work. I think that this is, again, like a problem that we have taken for granted, a sort of understanding that we've taken for granted that, as Leah was pointing out, the only real work, the only real productivity is what can be measured in GDP gains or a taxable paycheck. But in fact, so much production, so much of our most important work does take place in the home, does take place outside of the regularized workplace. And one of the things that I'm hoping will change after this pandemic, and does seem to be changing a little bit now, is that we begin to recognize that. So, point of clarification, I suppose both can be one and the same.
Right, right. So we have another question. So do you think the renewed focus, and I'll open this to all three of you, do you think the renewed focus on family policy is mainly a response to COVID, or do you think other factors such as atomization of the family were already leading us in this direction?
I think one thing COVID did is it really exposed how thin the interpersonal safety net can be for families. When schools closed, and again, disproportionately women left their jobs, you really saw how little ability many families had to absorb a blow or a disruption. And that's not sustainable. It's not sustainable during COVID when the blow comes on everyone at once. But in ordinary life, people go through crises. They just don't do it all at the same time. So you lack that sense of solidarity. A family that can't easily weather a school closure can't easily weather, the father's mother getting dementia. And so now they also have to figure out how to take care of the grandmother of their children. And how will that disrupt their jobs? How will that disrupt their childcare? How will that reshape their family life? People need more slack, more elasticity, more ability to absorb disruptions and adapt to them. And COVID exposed what's been a pervasive problem, but it exposed it for everyone at the same time. And I really hope that we kind of build back better, that we try and give families the tools they need, and everyone, again, not just families, everyone the tools they need to be able to weather disruptions in their life and be able to take on other people's burdens, to say, while you're working on, what your Nana needs, I will come over every night with the kids and put them to bed as your neighbor, as your sister, as your friend. But, I think as we look around, we see that, we see the declining birth rate. We can see that for many families, having a child is that kind of blow they feel they can't absorb. That the gap between the number of children women want and the number of children they have is itself a crisis. It's not just that we're not at a replacement rate level. There's a crisis in the gap between women's desired fertility and what they're getting. And again, this is somewhere where I wish I'd see a little more enthusiasm from, again, the ostensibly pro-life GOP to really lean into this and say, we have a dearth of babies and a horrific excess of abortions. What's going wrong here? And for the Democrats, with an interest in reproductive justice, to say there's a real injustice when women can't have the babies, when fathers can't have the babies that they long for. And we don't just want to track, our worries about unwanted pregnancies. We want to track our worries about wanted pregnancies and what makes them feel impossible for parents.
Yeah, I would agree with that in the main. I think that COVID was just, as the UN Secretary General said last year, it was the X-ray that revealed the fractures. But I would point out that there were people who were perceptively pointing to the need to focus on family policy. There were people who were pointing to a social crisis that existed that was certainly impacting families. And I just want to reference.
Are you referring to Capita, Joe?
Well, Capita was, yes, we were. No, but I even before that, right? Pope Francis in Laudato Si was identified a social crisis, a throwaway culture. And I think we have revealed, that COVID has revealed the extent to which we are comfortable sending some people into quote unquote essential jobs to risk, potential death and disaster, right, by getting COVID. And, so there were those who were being perceptive. And I think that this renewed focus on family policy also has to focus, as the Pope, I think, would remind us, on an economy, right, that is built for the freedom of corporations and is not built for the freedom of families and individuals to fulfill their duties, as Leah so beautifully articulated earlier.
Christine, do you have a response to the question? Did COVID accelerate what was already there, or did it make something out of whole cloth?
Yes, no, I think I would agree with our other panelists in saying that COVID did expose what was already there. There wasn't anything new except the pandemic happened to life as it existed, to life as we assumed was normal. I do think, though, that there was an emergent concern even before COVID happened. I mean, we can actually just point to the existence of IFS itself. I think that people are noticing that families are shrinking or ceasing to exist. I think there was already notice that our fertility rate had fallen and was beginning to drop precipitously. That's something that I had been writing about for years, even before the pandemic. And unfortunately, I think that had begun to catch attention because of its economic component, because there was a realization that, oh no, people are not having babies. How are we going to pay for Social Security in the future? Oh no, who is going to fill these jobs and buy our products? But at the same time, there is a deeper meaning and a deeper loss that Leah points out. This inability of mothers and fathers to have the children that they desperately want, a fear that has become pervasive in younger generations of the idea of finding a partner and forming a family because it seems too hard. There's no support. It would be too expensive. That's a sign of an unhealthy and, in fact, literally shrinking society. And I think that COVID has brought the ways that our society is, crushing individuals and crushing families to the fore. But that realization was coming forward already, even before the pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to just remark that you have to practice sending out checks from the federal government. And although the child tax credit is now old, but just the frequency with which the federal government was, or the infrequency, but the frequency with which the federal government was sending out checks to suffering families, I think has had probably an effect on the political situation, and that you by doing it, you realize that this doesn't cause harm, this causes benefit. But all right, so let's turn to our next and last question from the audience, and then I'm going to leave you with one more question. So is there room in a governmental family policy that supports faith-based initiatives? It's a little bit of a change of what we've been focusing on, but I'd love your thoughts on it nonetheless.
I think the answer is we keep waiting for updates from the Supreme Court, every session to find out if the answer is yes or no. I hope it's the case, in part because I want a variety of groups that are plugged into people's needs on the ground to be the ones helping people in these situations. I think the government should reach out to a diverse range of faith-based groups, and for groups that, have different reasons for their solidarity. But when we're talking about something that's as intimate as the family, people often want to hear not from, someone who's going to speak in terms of, we're very, very happy to congratulate you on the birth of your child, which has changed our Social Security projections, by the following rate. They want to hear from someone who's going to speak in a language that makes sense to them, that kind of treats the immensity of what a child is seriously. And often for folks, that's folks in their religious tradition or a cultural tradition. So it's better to speak with many voices, to speak, with the faith-based metaphor myself, like the apostles did at Pentecost, speaking to everyone in the language they recognize, conveying the same message, then to kind of reach for a blander approach that is meant to offend no one, but also include no one.
All right, Joe, Christine, anything on that? Or I can then serve up my final question. Should I move to that?
Sure.
Go for it.
All
I
right.
can only agree.
All right, so so this question is a little bit artificial because I think you'd prefer not to do what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to pick one family policy. And if you were to choose one to help American families, what would you choose and why? I imagine you'd prefer to choose more than one, but I'm going to restrict you to one. So, and why? So what would you choose and why?
Well, I answered this question on Twitter the other day, so I can go first and say that we do not have a family policy. And step one would be to create a comprehensive all of government family policy in the way that we did, and this is, I'm indebted to Daniel Patrick Moynihan here, the way we did in the 1946 Employment Act. We created a whole of government approach to employment. And rather than having family policies carved out in this department or that department with, some deputy assistant subsecretary at HHS responsible, we have to have a whole of government, all of government, comprehensive family policy. And I would commend to everyone the declaration of policy that was contained in that 1946 Employment Act for a sense of what a whole of government policy might be. And if we were to apply that for families, it would absolutely be transformative.
Joe, I believe you just did a little judo there. It was, you pick one, the one I will choose is all.
Yes, all for sure.
But Leah, Christine.
I mean, if we're picking one and it's one because there's one name and it's all in one PDF, I picked Matt Bernick's Family Fun Pack, which covers subsidies to parents,
Right.
child leave to spend time with your family, expanded insurance. But if I do have to pick kind of only one intervention, which I think is what you were trying to trap us into, I picked the big pile of money given to families and broadly to anyone taking on a significant caregiving burden. So it's also a big pile of money sent the same way Romney would, monthly, unconditionally, no means testing, no aggressive qualification that might turn away the people who most need it, who can least navigate bureaucratic hurdles. And I pick it for parents or for people caring for an elderly parent or a sick relative. And I pick money because hopefully it can make more room for everything else. It's less personal, it's less tailored, but the more you send, the more possible it is to take leave, even if your employer doesn't offer it because you can afford it, to buy the childcare you need at a fair rate for the childcare provider because you can afford it. And most of all, the more money we give to parents and to caregivers, the more pressure we're putting on their jobs or anything else to compete and make a fair offer against that. Just like we've seen expanded unemployment put pressure on employees who weren't offering a living wage to offer a sustainable wage, better working conditions. The more power workers have to say no to a job, the better jobs have to get. And I think there are a lot of jobs that can stand to have better terms in America than they do now. I'm less worried about businesses going under because they're founded on an impractical and unsustainable way of employing people.
Christine, final word to you.
It's always a bit wretched to go after Leah because she says everything so much better than I ever could. But I would agree. I'd have to go with the big pile of money. And yes, rather, in fact, than tying it to our, frankly, confusing and mystifying and often segregating tax code, I would find a way to send it even more directly to parents. Because, again, I guess just echoing what Leah says, in our society, as unfortunate as this may sound, money does equal freedom. Freedom to choose what you want to do with your family, freedom to choose what job you want to take. Even if you don't have paid leave, freedom to take vacation and just pay for it with the big pile of cash that came in the mail. And if we want to create slack for families, if we want families to be able to expand in different directions, change direction according to their needs, they need that freedom. And the best way that we have to do that right now, at least, is by simply giving them money.
Great. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed this. And next time I'm going to have to invite a jerk on the panel because there was just way too much camaraderie in this. But no, really, thank you all. Leah, Joe, Christine, it was wonderful. And I want to thank Joe Hine, who's produced this cast here. Thank you to Plow Quarterly. We're grateful to all of our audience members for joining us. And thank you all. And may our families be well in the future by the policies we enact.
Amen.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for having us.